Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm very excited to be joined with Sanchali Pal. Sanchali, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sanchali is the founder of Joro, an app that monitors consumer spending to offer tips on how to offset and reduce a user's carbon footprint, which is a very important and relevant problem that people are facing right now. Joro raised a $2.5 million round led by Sequoia Capital in early 2021. And very excited to be here. I think you have a pretty interesting career path to this point, but just to kick it off, I was thinking that you're starting a company that's focused on this massive problem of climate change. You've decided to focus more on the consumer and help them change their behaviors and their patterns. I know you spent some time in Ethiopia and on that side and got an MBA from Harvard. I was thinking if it would be helpful if you could just start from the beginning of what led to Joro and kind of walk us through some of that. It would be interesting before we go deep into that.
Yeah, I feel like the idea for Joro has been a kernel in my mind since I was in college and then really started to become something that felt like it could be a company a few years ago. When I was a senior in college, I saw the documentary Food Inc., and it was a really important turning point for me. I think I had this moment where I was like, oh, I eat food and I care about the systems that create that food. Maybe I should be more intentional about how I buy and eat food. Like, I don't know why I'd never thought about that before, but I was an economics major. I was taking a sustainable economics class, and I was the manager in my dining hall at the same time. So it kind of just clicked for me. I was like, oh. So then the next day, I went to have a meeting with the staff of the dining hall where we were deciding how much food to order. And I was like, why do we have four meat dishes and one vegetarian dish in the dining hall? What would it take to make one of those meat dishes a vegetarian dish? And they're like, oh, well, if we had five more vegetarians, it would make sense math wise to just have another vegetarian dish. So we did the math, and I was like, okay, I think I can find five people to at least say they're vegetarian. And
Right.
then we could change this because that's all that matters is the signal. So we did that, and it would have an impact of taking hundreds of cars off the road in a year just by making that small change. So
Wow.
that was, I started tracking my own carbon footprint after that. I was like, what are these leverage points that are achievable? I'm willing to do them. Like, I wasn't willing to be fully vegetarian, but I was willing to cut down my meat consumption significantly. So I cut down my meat consumption from 12 meals a week to 2 meals a week. I decided I was going to walk and bike more on weekdays. Anyways, I had a bike. I just was kind of lazy sometimes and took cars. And I started creating a flight budget for myself that was both dollars and carbon. And I became a management consultant after college, focused on international development. So while I was living in New York, I had to fly a lot. It caused me to take longer trips instead of flying back and forth as much. So I'd go stay in country in Ethiopia, where my first project was, for 4 weeks at a time instead of flying back and forth. But it caused me to make choices that actually made my life better in a lot of ways. So while I was in consulting, I worked in New York. I actually moved to Bombay, to their office in Bombay, and then moved to Ethiopia to start their office in Ethiopia. And when I was
And
there,
this was with Dalberg, right?
yes, that's right.
Interesting. Okay. I know
And
they're
so
known for international development and focusing on these larger issues. So it would be interesting, I guess, after this, also hearing about some of the principles that you learned there and how to think about this both from when you had this kernel of a thought in college and started tracking your carbon footprint and how a large organization is also moving some of this change forward too.
it was, I loved my first job out of college working at Dahlberg was like a real treat because I got to learn all these skills for management consulting, but also focus on problems that I was really passionate about. I worked a lot on agriculture, infrastructure development, economic development projects. And when I was in Ethiopia, we were working on a big agriculture project trying to help the government attract private sector capital into agribusiness. So I spent a lot of time in rural parts of the country talking to entrepreneurs, writing up business plans, doing due diligence, and then sharing that due diligence with private equity investors to get them to come start projects. And in that process, I saw the effects of the climate crisis on real people that I knew. I saw that it was a drought in 2015. It was the biggest drought in decades in Ethiopia. And so I saw people's livelihoods just being destroyed in a single season. And I realized the climate crisis was this thing I'd learned about intellectually and I thought was really far away, but it was already happening to a lot of people, to millions of people. And I needed to focus on this. I couldn't just do it on the side. Like in my own
Hmm.
life, I needed to focus my whole career on climate because this was the thing. And it didn't matter
Interesting.
if it was agriculture, infrastructure, manufacturing, everything was affected by climate.
Wow.
So I went to business school. with the idea that I'm going to use these 2 years to learn as much as I can about the climate crisis, about the energy sector, and find where I can be useful in scaling up needed business models to address the crisis. I actually worked at Tesla over the summer. I thought it was a really great experience, and I thought that's what I was going to do after school. But over the course of talking to people about my own climate practices, especially in business school, you have a lot of social interactions, and it comes up like if you're vegetarian one day and you're not vegetarian another way a day, people are confused.
Right,
Or if
right.
you say like I'm going to be a little late because I'm biking there, they'll be like, "What? Why don't you just
Yeah,
take an Uber?"
right.
um, so those were by talking to people, by being forced to talk to people about my own practices, I actually realized there were a lot of people who were interested in finding some achievable path to taking climate action in their own lives. People thought you had to be vegan and like live in the woods, or you had to be a bad person. There was like no middle ground. And what I found is there's really, really important ways you can align your lifestyle with your values and have a major impact, even in just 1 year. And especially if you do it with other people, you just multiply your impact significantly. Like if everyone in the US reduced or offset our footprint by 50%, we'd have an impact equal to taking all of the cars off the road and shutting down all the coal plants. So it's
Wow.
significant because our spending affects over 65% of global emissions. The way that households spend money affects 65% of emissions. So that was when the idea for Joro was born. And when I discovered this sort of really interesting connection between finance and carbon footprints, because emissions come from consumption, from our use of resources. So having a data feed like your credit or debit card data is actually a really helpful insight into your carbon footprint and helps eliminate that manual tracking barrier.
Very interesting. Can you go into a bit about how that actually works? Does it layer into your kind of your credit card data and pull that in? And then how do you on the back end measure what the carbon emissions would be per purchase, or how does that actually interact with consumers?
Yes, so if you download Joro from the App Store, you'll go through the onboarding process. At the end of the onboarding process, it'll ask you to connect your credit or debit cards if you want to get automated tracking. That's free, so you can connect your credit or debit cards. And based on your financial transactions that come in, for instance, if you spend $100 at the grocery store, we'll give you a carbon footprint based on the carbon intensity per dollar of a grocery purchase. And then we also ask you for a little more information about yourself so we can make that a bit more accurate. So if we know you're vegetarian, for instance, your carbon intensity per dollar of groceries will be lower than someone who eats meat. And we'll ask you for enough detail to be able to give you a good enough estimate that doesn't require you to constantly input information.
And can you give us some examples? So, what does the average U.S. citizen, for example, what does their carbon output look like right now? And where are certain smaller efforts that they can begin to make in order to offset that? You touched on some about riding a bike and walking more, reducing the meat consumption. But what are other areas that you found when you're working with consumers that they find more accessible versus not, or how you convince them in order to make an impact here?
So there's four main categories of emissions that we think about, and they're the same as our national level emissions. So also the carbon intensity per dollar values that we derive are based on the economy's carbon intensity per dollar, which is how the US calculates its carbon emissions. So the US is saying, okay, we're creating like 1,000 wood-based furniture products, and wood-based furniture products have a carbon intensity per dollar of this. So then we translate that. That's the work that our algorithms do, is translate those values to consumer values. So there's some transformation that has to happen, but it's essentially the same concept. So the four categories of our economy's emissions are the same as the four categories of our own emissions, which are basically industry or shopping, food and agriculture, land use, um, travel, and home energy use. And across the US, those four categories are roughly similar size buckets. So 20 to 25% of the average person's emissions fall into each of those buckets, I guess 20 to 30% depending on some variation. But they're all quite large. And so within each of them, there's actions you can take that matter. For food, of course, one of the major drivers is what you're eating and how it's produced. So red meat is about at least 10 times more carbon intensive than vegetarian meals, and also like at least 7 or 8 times more carbon intensive than white meat. Um, Within travel, flying is a really big source of emissions. One round trip flight from San Francisco to New York is about the same footprint as an average American's month of total energy use. Um, But also, like your gas car is probably a pretty big driver of emissions. Maybe even just carpooling or taking public transit a little more often could make a pretty big impact. And within your home, energy use is usually sucked up by heating and cooling, whether that's heating or cooling of air or heating and cooling of water. Those are the biggest, most energy intensive uses of within your home. And for shopping, a lot of things that you might not think about. I think it's really easy to just buy a t-shirt and like not think about it.
Right.
But a t-shirt has a higher carbon footprint than a burger. Um, so just thinking of trying to create that intuition for where carbon comes from. It's just like we have an intuition for our steps now, we have an intuition for calories. We're trying to help people develop an intuition for carbon. You might not always make the lowest calorie decision, you may not always make the
Right.
lowest carbon choice, but at least you know when you are.
That's very interesting. And I know in the beginning you've spoken about this publicly, but I guess it would be interesting to hear the evolution of the product. You started tracking this all in a spreadsheet and kind of bringing maybe your friends or other consumers in to do the same. And now you've automated a lot of this data feed and bringing it out. Can you talk a bit about that process of beta testing this and then how the consumer's journey has changed, like how you ensure compliance, how you get them to be more aware if they haven't been aware in the past about this. You've experienced this problem firsthand, and I know some people in the US are experiencing it firsthand now, but your experiences in Ethiopia are different. So how you get them to actually think about this on a daily basis when they are making purchase would be also helpful to hear.
In terms of product evolution, I realized very early on that using an Excel spreadsheet was very tedious because I was doing it myself. So I went from doing it like every day when I'd first built it for this course I was in to doing it maybe once a week to checking it once a month. And then once a month was kind of the cadence I stuck with because I would say like, okay, I generally know the parameters of how I'm living. I'm trying to hit these few goals this month. Let's see if I can do it. Um, then when I started doing this for other people, I realized, especially when I was in business school, I was just other friends were saying like, what are my most impactful actions? So I tried to do a quick analysis for them and find areas that they could change. And then the real important thing was tracking it over time to see if there was any difference and if that difference would matter in the long run. So I found that doing it for a couple months with people was possible, but beyond that, with manual tracking, it was really difficult. And so I started looking and researching on different data feeds. I was at Harvard, I went and talked to a bunch of researchers. I went across the river to MIT to go see there's a lot of interesting work happening on carbon tracking there, and met some graduate students and started a group together to look at different automated data feeds and the potential of them for consumer tracking. We looked at location data, we looked at utilities data, and then we looked at financial data. And no one had done much with financial data. I thought it was really interesting from an academic perspective. There was a lot of research on utilities and locations, which are very granular data feeds and much better suited for research. But financial transactions give us a much more holistic picture of our consumption and allow us to make choices that will move money. So they're more consequential decisions.
That's very
And
interesting.
so that was what I got really interested in. And when I graduated, I spent a few months just exploring that idea of doing a ton of user interviews and thinking about the potential financial data. Did that align with what my users were saying? And eventually built a really simple MVP with like the most the most simple and rudimentary that you could imagine. Like literally, there's like 10 categories of stuff, and we're going to assign a carbon intensity to each of those 10 buckets. And even with that, we were able to give people some really useful feedback that they were able to stick with for 3 months, 4 months, or maybe longer. And so that's what gave us the inspiration to sort of start building this out in a more robust way. But I would say a big learning has been that not everyone starts from a place of wanting to change behavior. That was how I started, but that's actually probably less common among consumers. People usually start from a place of wanting to do something and wanting to find the least obtrusive thing they can try first. And that's where offsets come into the picture of if you can't reduce your emissions or if you're not willing to yet, putting a price on carbon by purchasing effective carbon offsets that are reducing or removing emissions somewhere else in the world can be really valuable. So that same year I was getting married, I decided to offset the flights for my friends and family who were coming to the wedding. And it took me 1 year to find offsets that I felt excited about to buy, especially because I was buying them on behalf of my friends and family. I was worried they weren't going to be good enough and that they weren't
Right.
actually going to reduce or remove the carbon they said they were. And I just went into this big research hole again of trying to figure it out. So now coming out of that, a year and a half later, we now have an offset subscription product that allows people to buy into a high quality of offsets, the same kind of quality that companies like Microsoft, Shopify, Stripe are buying into. They have whole sustainability teams doing that work for them so that they're not buying the wrong offsets, and we do that work for our customers now as well.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, yeah, I've been hearing about the offset market and actually thinking about the efficacy of some of the offsets you can buy. We've heard projects as simple as planting a tree, but then also seaweed farms and things like that. They're actually planting in the middle of the ocean. Could you talk a bit about how you evaluate offsets, which ones you actually bring onto is it, I guess it's a marketplace on Joro that folks can buy through? Or maybe even your research process of when you were getting married. Can you talk about some of the offsets that you find to be a higher efficacy versus lower, how an average consumer can think about that, or some of these solutions that the larger companies are using too?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is that no offset project is perfect. No matter what technology or approach or part of nature you're trying to protect, there's always risks. And so the point of purchasing offsets is to try to maximize your impact, do as best you can as to try to compensate for your emissions, recognizing that it's not as good as just getting rid of them in the first place with 100% certainty. It just can't be because you're not doing it yourself. So with that recognition, I think it's helpful. It sort of allowed me to release this idea that one offset is better than another. One method of absorbing carbon isn't necessarily better than another, but they're different. So trees are a really important part of our natural carbon cycle, and they do store carbon for us in their mass in the tree. But there's, of course, risks. They're susceptible to disease or to natural disaster. They don't last forever. They last for maybe like 50 or 100 or 200 years, but they eventually might return to the earth and decompose and release carbon back into the atmosphere. But we've deforested a lot of the earth, and we're not using as much of that natural resource as we could be. So it's important to support protection of our forests and restoration of forests. Also, there's some really cool technologies like direct air capture that allow us to, with a lot more certainty, capture carbon and store it permanently underground so that we know that's not coming out again in 30 or 40 years. We know that's staying under there for millennia. But those projects have very little co-benefits. They don't support local communities. They don't necessarily enhance local ecosystems. They also use a lot of energy to capture that carbon. So there's positives and negatives about different types of projects. What we do for our customers is we create a portfolio of offsets. So just like you wouldn't put all your money into one stock, we don't put all your offsets into just one project. We balance it for risk and reward. So we align with a sort of international standard that came out last year called the Oxford Offsetting Principles, which says what are the types of climate solutions we need to invest in to achieve net zero by 2050. We need a balance of these different kinds of projects. So we apply that balance. We have some short-term projects in the form of soil carbon sequestration. So we support farmers using regenerative agriculture techniques to store carbon in soil. We also support medium-term projects like forestry projects that might be protected for 50 years or 100 years and that store carbon in forests. We support seaweed projects, which are super interesting. The
Right.
ocean is a major carbon sink, and same with the plants in them that might be able to store carbon deep in the ocean for thousands of years. And then same with a project called Charm Industrial, which takes agricultural waste and turns it into carbon-rich bio-oil and actually injects it underground, similar to the way direct air capture does, but using agricultural waste to do so. So those are the projects that we support now. We have 6 providers across those 4 categories, and every few months we update what's available for our customers by doing new research.
That's very interesting. Can you talk a bit? I mean, this is a consumer app at the end of the day, and you're also vying for consumer attention with other financial apps. I mean, you have the Robinhoods and the Betterments, and then you also have things on the climate side, and you have stuff on social and people's phones and their engagement and actually being able to download an app. Can you talk about how you've thought about growth hacking this and scaling it with consumers and customers and getting them to understand and care about the problem? And then the natural extension of that question is how hopeful are you based off of what you've seen with consumer behavior and where else we still need work to get to that net zero target?
We're still very early days, just starting to figure out growth. So far, most of our users have come from people who found us on their own. So I think that was our earliest target market is people who are so interested in this that they're searching for it. They're creating spreadsheets like I was. They're already finding ways. Maybe they're already buying from like 3 or 4 offset projects because they know they're not happy with just one. So those are our early users. And now we're starting to think about how do we grow beyond that to people who have thought about offsets, might know what a carbon footprint is, care enough about climate change to have figured that out, but don't really know where to start. And those are the people we're trying to find through influencer marketing, through content marketing. Um, it's not yet like a part of mainstream culture, which is a good
Right.
place for us to be as a startup because we're a little out ahead, but there's a lot of education work to do. There's the education work to let people know that your spending is a good predictor of your carbon footprint. Like, why should I be connecting my card into this climate app? What's the connection? That's like the first step of awareness. And then what can I be doing about it? What is an offset? Those kinds of questions are still, I think, not mainstream questions. So we're going out and trying to do a lot of that education work through putting out content, through working with influencers and partnerships to try to raise sort of cultural awareness about what this is. And then I think longer term, there's definitely opportunities for scale through both social and sort of referrals, as well as business partnerships. So companies who care about climate, if we can start surfacing emissions of on the company level, which is what we're working on next. We're not only saying the carbon footprint of buying coffee, but the carbon footprint of buying coffee from Starbucks
Right.
could become opportunities to start partnering with brands and creating awareness through them.
Very interesting. So, Charlie, this is super helpful, and I hope this also helps spread awareness for very meaningful problems. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.